Hey everybody, welcome back to the Making Space podcast, where we're exploring the intersection between the spaces we inhabit in our churches and outside of our churches, and the way we're being formed into the people of God. As always, I'm Jay, and I am here with my co-host, Benjamin Windle. Great to see you. You're looking as fine as ever, man.
Well,
always.
Jay, I appreciate that, of course. And maybe it's because all of us today are in the state of California. We'll introduce our guest in a moment, but I think that's pretty cool. Yeah. And as I was just saying, I've got great internet today, Jay. So I'm winning. I'm feeling good about life. And you know what? Talking about space, and the podcast and what we're discussing here in these conversations, in just such a simplistic but profound way, when we walk into buildings and physical spaces, there is something about those spaces that speak to us. I was at a cool bakery yesterday, rode my e-bike down there. Think of it, Jay, e-bike. I'm not sure if you're hipster enough to be using one of those yet, but I rode my e-bike down there.
It's very Californian of you.
Thank you.
Actually.
And there's this cool trellis and vine and graffitied wall and little fountain. I'm like, this space speaks to me about something.
Yep.
And so I think when it comes to pastoring and churches, our physical spaces are saying something to every single person that interacts with our ministries. And so I'm excited for our conversation today.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And along those lines, actually, one of the people in my life that's been so informative and inspiring and thought-provoking for me when it comes to these intersections you were talking about is the person we're talking to today. He's a personal friend and someone I've admired for a long time. Dave Lomas is the lead pastor and the founding pastor of Reality San Francisco. He planted it with his wife in 2010 and doing incredible work in a very challenging city to be a church, San Francisco. He's also the author of The Truest Thing About You, which was a book that was sort of birthed out of his first few years at Reality SF. And Dave is truly one of the people I look to when it comes to many things, but in particular, when it comes to the importance of the intersection between our formation and the spaces that we inhabit. So I'm so excited for our conversation. Dave, it's good to see you, man. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Jay. It's so good to be here. Benjamin, pleasure to meet you. This is so fun to be on this podcast. I only just barely discovered that this is a thing, and I'm so excited about talking about this. You have no idea.
That's right. Yeah, I saw you post about it recently, and I could just feel your excitement because it makes sense to me because, Dave, I know you've been thinking about this for a long time. You've sort of embodied it in your own life. You and I have sat down and had conversations about how deep this is sort of in your body and bones, the importance of physical spaces and how they form us. So we don't typically begin with questions so big and so broad, but I want to do that with you. Talk just generally speaking for you, why you think that intersection matters so much, the intersection between physical space and our formation, discipleship to Jesus. Talk about that intersection.
Oh, that is such a huge question. So I think where I'd probably start, why I think it's so important, is because we are embodied creatures. I think I'd start with embodiment. We are not just a brain on a stick. We are not just our heart or our mind. We are a body. And because we're a body, this goes into things that people have written back, from Eugene Peterson to Jamie Smith to Windle to, all of these people that have written on our formation takes place in a place, and our surroundings shape us and teach us what a telos is, what the goal of life is, what's good to live for, what's good to pursue. All of that is done with more than just our mental capacity, but our bodies. So that's why it's important to me. I think when churches just try to disciple the brain and not immerse them in a a whole life kind of immersive formational experience or process, or whatever you want to call it, I think you're kind of falling into this dualism, this Gnosticism, this ancient thing that the church has always battled. Anyways, I'll stop there. We can talk about
Yeah.
them. But I think that's one of the reasons why it's like we're a body. We're people that have senses, inputs, all kinds of input senses.
Yeah. Some of that is expressed in your sort of personal passion for architecture in general, and then specifically sort of church architecture. I've actually heard you use the phrase in a conversation we've had, sacred architecture. And I know you give a lot of time and energy to that. It's a passion of yours. Before we get to your church, Benjamin's got some question about that, but just talk generally about that, about what you're seeing maybe when it comes to churches at large, and maybe if there is even maybe some things we might be missing in terms of the way we think about the architecture of churches, the physical, actual architecture of churches.
Yeah. So I was recently in Oxford and touring the churches in Oxford. And I had a couple of thoughts. The first thought that I had and our group had was, I understand why all of these epic stories have come out of Oxford, because you're immersed in a transcendent, sacred imagination. You're immersed in it, and you can't help but imagine something beyond yourself. As one of the priests of one of the churches I was at was saying, the idea of sacred architecture is that your feet, as a human from the dirt, are firmly rooted in the ground, but you're drawn up to the heavens. That is the purpose of sacred architecture. It's like you are a human, fully rooted into the ground, but you're drawn up. So that was one of the thoughts. The other thought I had was that when these churches were constructed, there was no entertainment. There was no visual stimulation. So you would go into churches for visual stimulation. You would go for imagination. You would go for art. You would go for beauty. It was like, I would imagine how drab the world was then. And you get the colors of stained glass. You get the colors of the chalices and the robes and the smells and all the stuff. And it would just ignite your senses. But now we have Netflix for that, right? We have Hollywood for that. We are we are so stimulated in all of these spaces. But what I think is happening right now, especially in this generation of people that I'm ministering to in San Francisco, all of that stuff, all that entertainment stuff, it doesn't work anymore. And we have disenchanted the world through the secular and modern project, and everyone's looking for a reenchantment. And I think the church, through architecture and beauty, not leaving out the prayer meeting, not leaving out the preaching of the scriptures, not leaving any of that out, because we give such a huge important place to that. But the church could immerse people in a reenchantment and imagining the kingdom. Like we haven't done it yet, but I want to create a church where our kids, when they're in children's ministry, they're imagining the kingdom of God breaking into a city. That are when people are walking up the steps of the church, they're imagining a pilgrimage, like literally a pilgrimage up to a building where they immerse themselves in a liturgy, like a full immersion in liturgy. And I think architecture plays a huge part in that. That I think, and again, I keep talking, but I think that reenchantment needs to happen.
That's beautifully described, Dave, and I enjoy just hearing that word reenchantment. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. So before I ask a little bit about specifically your church, just to set some context on the geography and city that you're in, you're pastoring in San Francisco. So just assume that a listener knows nothing about the city that you're in. Where is your church, and where is the building that you've purchased in the Mission District? Do you have one? Is that the location? Just help us understand context.
Yeah, so we are located in the Mission District of San Francisco, as you said. We started our church 13 years ago, and during COVID, during lockdown, we're able to purchase a building. Funny enough, it's the only building. There's not that many buildings large enough. Our church isn't large by like maybe national standards, but probably San Francisco standards is fairly large. And there's only probably a couple buildings that are church buildings that can fit us. And one of them came for sale in the neighborhood that we had planted our church in, the Mission District. And so Mission District is kind of right in the heart of the city. We're right in the corner where you have Noe Valley up one corner of our building where, a lot of the tech people, they call it Stroller Valley. A lot of the tech people raise their family. Then you have the historic Latino neighborhood down the other side of that street. And then you have the like where kind of hipster culture was birthed in Brooklyn and on Valencia Street, like way back, in the early like mid 2000 like 5 or whatever. Like just all of this street just became the center of all of that culture. And so we're in the middle of this whole place. We got this fairly large building for San Francisco standards, and that came with a beautiful history. So part of what we're trying to do here is like live into the history of this building that has a history and an identity before we got in here, but actually to reimagine this place, because it was kind of for a while the church was struggling, and it was kind of a church that was a non-place. It was just a place that people like. There's a building, and it had no sense of place. And so we are trying to create, working with architects now, to create a place, not just for our church, but for this neighborhood. So that's the little context of our church.
Okay, so it sounds like a real kind of cultural melting pot, so to speak. Sounds like a cool area. What's it like pastoring in this specific area that you're in, Mission District? And then I want to ask you about this facility. But firstly, what does it look like pastoring in that area?
Oh, I mean, I had nothing to compare it to because I only pastor in this area. So I think I'd say it's probably like everywhere else when you're pastoring predominantly a millennial congregation, but just probably more so because San Francisco is like, it's like everywhere else, but more so. So yeah, pastoring people that the other night we had a big sort of keynote annual vision and prayer night where part of that night I had everyone raise their hand. There was maybe, I don't know, I forget how many people were there, like 600 and something people. And I had everyone raise their hand, like raise your hand if you're under 35, we want to pray for you. And like 75% of the room raised their hand. So that's kind of like the demographic of our church is fairly young. And people move to San Francisco to work, and because most people are not from here. So they want to move here to live in the city. And then it's a melting pot of like grind and struggle and, angst and trying to make it, that sort of thing.
Are you a hipster, Dave? Do you fit into this hipster crowd?
Well, I think that's a thing it's not a thing anymore. It was a thing. It's not
Do you ride an e-bike?
A thing anymore.
Do you ride an e-bike?
I don't ride an e-bike.
Well, you're not as hipster as me.
That is
you and Jay together.
I probably should get an e-bike.
So, quick question on this, Dave. In the research, this podcast is a collaboration between Barna and the Aspen Group, and the research found that Christian and non-Christians alike agreed that the church should look like the communities they serve. Okay, 77%. How would you interpret that? How does that speak to you? What would it look like to blur the lines between our church buildings and the communities that we serve and minister in?
That's a good question. I think the way I'd answer that question is I agree to an extent. I think that the church must honor and serve the neighborhood that they live in, that they're a part of, where it does overlap with the neighborhood to where the church is a place that's accessible. But I think it should pull them into something higher and greater. So I don't think so. Right here, if you're in my corner of San Francisco, if I made the church completely fit into the neighborhood, it would look no different than any other building. And so you walk in, it would have all the same architecture. It might look like an open warehouse with some like lamps hanging from the ceiling, like a lot of the coffee houses do. But that, again, I don't think that. I think there is a place to ask people that question, but I think what visionaries need to do is pull people out of that and go, let's allow. This is why processionals are really important in churches. Let's allow our plaza, which is the entryway of our church, and you walk up at the plaza, let that be the place where it looks exactly like the neighborhood. And you're able to, it's a place that meets a common area that's open all the time that people meet. but you're wanting to pull people into like from there to the foyer, the entryway, to there into the sanctuary, from the sanctuary to the altar. It should be pulling you in and pulling you up at the same time. That's what the architecture should be doing in church architecture, I believe. So I do agree with that, but I think that there has to be a meeting point, heaven and earth meeting point, and then it should draw you to heaven. That's what I'd say to that question.
Yeah, Dave, what you're doing, you're painting a picture of a journey, right? You're hoping that people can show up to church spaces and go on a journey, which I think is really interesting because citing some of the data that Barna and Aspen Group have also found, sometimes people don't know what they want, right? Like they don't know what they don't know. So there was a question posed, hey, to Christians and then to non-Christians, what do you think church spaces are for? What's the purpose of a church space? So a lot of Christians, like 43%, church spaces are for providing space for prayer, meditation, or reflection. 36% said it should be a space for spiritual growth. 32%, to facilitate worship or fellowship. And then non-Christians, actually, interestingly, about 35%, about a third said, well, church spaces should provide safety and security for people. 34% actually said, prayer, meditation, or reflection. 31% creating a space for community. Same amount, 31%. Churches should use their space for services or resources or as a shelter. So what's interesting to me in light of what you're saying is, these sorts of descriptors are what you're talking about when you talk about sort of the plaza of your church. And I've seen your building. It's this beautiful space. Talk a little bit about that intersection. This is kind of tagging on to Benjamin's question. There's the stuff that people say they think church spaces should be, and you're not saying those are wrong. You're just saying those are sort of like the entryway, the gateway drug into something maybe more transcendent that they can't even quite name. Talk about on the ground right now at Reality SF, because you do a lot of this stuff and you care deeply about justice. That's a big deal, particularly with kind of your surroundings and the demographics in the city of San Francisco. Talk about that, the journey you're taking where so much of Reality San Francisco on the outside looks very much like what maybe people expect when they think about church. And then the journey you're trying to take people on toward transcendence that they can't even quite maybe name yet.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, we have a really large emphasis. It used to be citywide emphasis on all sort of justice initiatives. And now then we got a building, we're a little trying to hone with like, what kind of things are we going to try to make an impact in through our kind of like our location, our place, because place matters. And so the way that we think about that, again, we bought this building, inherited this story, and are working with architects now to renovate it. And hopefully, God willing, in the next several years, we'll have this building renovated. But one of the things that we're asking right now, when we're working with a landscape architect, is how do we create a plaza that allows people? So we do a food pantry twice a week, and we serve over 170 families a week. And it's a farmers market style food pantry, and it's in our garage right now, our like underground garage, and that's where it's been since we inherited it. But we're going to try to move it to the plaza and make it like way more hospitable, to where not just are we giving people groceries, but providing hot meals but we want to put it in a space where, see, I think that people need both. You don't want to make something too nice where people don't want to walk on it. Like I can't go up there; it's too nice. But you don't want to make a place that so matches what's going on in the rest of the neighborhood to where there's nothing that pulls them out of this kind of world or this neighborhood even. I think people need access to public beauty and public art. San Francisco is really good at this, but it's usually downtown in affluent neighborhoods. It's not necessarily in the Mission District, there are pockets of it for sure, but like public free art where people are able to be in it. San Francisco again does a good job at that, but in our like vicinity, there's not that much. So we want to create that kind of space. So the plaza is more of that. It's like this community. We kind of think of it as the stoop of the neighborhood. So how do we create something where people want to gather, where you do events, where you invite the neighborhood in, where that sort of thing happens. We're able to serve our neighbors in our city and also allow it to be a place where people just get to meet other people in their communities. Like this is what plazas were, right? And churches and all across Europe, the plaza was a place that was for the community. And so redoing our plaza for the community. And then the hope is that if you transition the spaces right, it should pull people in, right? It should make people curious. So this is the plaza. What's behind that glass wall or whatever, you know? And so that's kind of what we're trying to do: pull people in through architecture.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that question, Dave. So think about, the church leader that's listening right now, and they're saying, yeah, that's awesome, Dave. Your church is in the heart of San Francisco, which is one of the most creative cities in the world. Let's say they're like, well, my church is in the suburbs in a business park, and we lease this building, and it's next to a bunch of, drab, beige business buildings, but I'm in. I want to try to create that sort of space. So talk to the leader who doesn't find themselves surrounded by that sort of creativity, but longs to create a transcendent space that sort of disrupts the drabness of their current surroundings. Just high level, big picture, what's a way that maybe some leaders can begin thinking about that, despite some of the sort of surrounding physical even challenges that they find themselves in?
Yeah. So that is a good question. Well, okay. If someone, again, I served at a church in Bakersfield, that's where I'm from, which is the Central Valley of California, and exactly what you're describing, business park, like literally that. So I say a couple things. First, the power of trees, like plant trees. So typically in business parks and these kind of places, it's like you park right up against the building. Like find a way, hire some architecture, find some people from your church that like, let's recreate this space to where there's like, you park pretty far away or away from the building where you're walking into what feels like a garden where people want to be and hang out. So it's not like driveway or a parking lot and then curb and then building. Like, how do you put a green space there? So think about that. Think of processionals. Like, I think processionals is a really important word. Think about like what it means to be here and then you move in. I mean, this is literally the courts in the temple, right? Like they had these courts and these courts and these courts, and you had a Holy of Holies. Imagine things like that. Imagine the courts, the outer courts, these places where it's the common area, where it's beautiful and it draws you in. And then you move into the foyer, and then the things in the foyer or the entryway are formative. The architecture is formative, and it causes you to kind of start getting immersed in a story. What story are you telling? And then how do you move into the stage? And because I think that a lot of churches design for production, and that's kind of how people design churches, is for production. And I don't think that's necessarily bad. I think that, I might be dipping into kind of like cultural angst here a bit, but I think that a lot of people that we all read about that are leaving the church, there's nothing. A lot of people will leave a church and they will turn to more of a high church, even though a lot of high churches, their theology gets really have been really destroyed, But what I think what's happening is people want to move into a place that is more sacred and more holy, and they want what they're being taught and what they're being immersed into to tell a bigger story. And so that's what I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I also think if you actually talk to people that are leaving the church, it's not they're leaving the church because the way the stage is set up, but I think it's because we kind of, again, teach the mind, elevate the sermon as the only thing that's going on in the building, and all that matters is if it's lit well and the sound is good, instead of it being more of an immersive, like you're a whole person, you're immersed into this larger story. So I think that is actually a lot of the wiring of younger people coming up that I've seen that are really turning to more ancient practices and wanting to visit monasteries and like all that.
So in some ways, Dave, we're getting what we designed for. If we're building and creating event centers and production environments, we're getting it. And yes, it's a necessary part of most of our churches, but it's good food for thought and consideration in terms of just our design of space and particularly what new generations are responding to. So I found our conversation today, Dave, so incredibly insightful. Thank you for your thoughts. Thank you for your ministry and your leadership in the Mission District and your time with us today. As we close this conversation, would there be any encouragement that you'd like to leave leaders and pastors with?
I would encourage pastors and leaders to think about the spaces that we are creating and how they're shaping the whole person and what our buildings are saying. You opened up, Benjamin, with walking into a coffee shop, or I forget what it was, and how that shaped you. And I think that we need to be thinking like that as leaders. How are the places that we are creating, calling people into, shaping their imagination? Because if you can't imagine the kingdom of God breaking in to the world, then they can't work toward it. So how do our spaces help people imagine the kingdom?
Well, thank you so much, Dave. We really appreciate it. And Jay, what a great conversation. I think that our time with Dave today actually captured a lot of things that we've been talking about, almost the essence of some of what we've been discussing. He's articulated some of those aspects so well. What's something that jumped out to you, Jay, in this conversation?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think Dave, not just in this conversation, but just knowing Dave, he does embody so much of the heartbeat of the conversations that we're having on this podcast. One of the things I appreciate so much about Dave and his ministry, he really does, in so many ways, he pushes us toward, he used the word many times, pushes us toward imagination. And, that juxtaposition between production, you could almost juxtapose production and imagination. And they're not necessarily opposed to each other, but typically production is way more controlled. It's really precise, and that's not a bad thing. But there is something beautifully wild about imagination. And I love the sort of challenge and the push, no matter what sorts of spaces. I'm thinking about my own church, and Dave's been to my church. He knows, like, we're sort of on the corner of the suburbs and a little bit of like business, and then like down the street from Apple. So it's like a strange place, but definitely, one of the challenges we face is that we are such a production-based sort of space. That's how it feels. But I think one of the encouraging things for me when I listen to Dave, and especially when he talks to leaders who lead in those types of spaces, it is possible to spark curiosity,
Correct.
Heighten the imagination, even if you find yourself in a space that isn't like San Francisco or London or, Manhattan or something. Like, it is possible to do small things in really intentional ways that create some of that transcendence. I love what he said, what he heard from that Oxford scholar about, man, as human beings, we live with our feet firmly planted to the ground, but the goal is to lift our gaze to the bigness above us. I love that push. Can we live as church leaders and lead with a wild imagination, a wildness, and a pursuit of beauty and wonder and transcendence? It is challenging, but I think in some ways, we've got to desire that, embody that ourselves. So I just feel like personally convicted as a pastor as I'm listening to Dave talk. What about you, Benjamin? What stood out to you?
Well, I'm a pastor's kid. I was raised in the church. I was raised in an era where production was not as good. I don't long for a return to that. I think we've made ground, and some of what we've brought about by excellence has been needed. But and there are no easy ways to accommodate large numbers of people without auditoriums. And then if you have large numbers of people, you want it to sound good. It has to be well lit if you're going to be effective. Things are broadcast online on our phones. So I think there's a practical reality to a lot of that. When I hear these kind of conversations about beauty and imagination and re-enchanting generations with what these kinds of sacred spaces can look like, my encouragement to pastors would be, you have an auditorium, but it's not the only square footage you have. Think foyers, think entrances, think about what Dave said in terms of you drive up. Is there anything between the concrete and that building? Can you plant trees? Can you make it have that, garden-esque symbolism as you walk into it? So where we can make up ground is in, I think, a lot of those other areas, and Dave spoke about that processional idea. You're moving people. So much of formation and discipleship is about moving people spiritually. What a great thought that we're also moving people literally and physically through our spaces. Right. Facilities are expensive. You may not have enough money to go and build a grand cathedral in a cool hipster downtown area, right? So I think finding that balance between, I've got practical needs, I have maintenance, I've got a limited budget, but conceptually, where can I bring about re-enchantment, beauty, and meaning in the physical spaces that we're gathering people? To me, the more we can get that into our conversations as pastors and churches, who knows where that will lead to as we reimagine physical spaces and spiritual formation in the future.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think there are great challenges before us, but I think it starts with small steps of imagination that sort of break the boundaries of what we think is and just accept as normative, and it's going to be difficult, obviously, to tear down your building and build a great cathedral in a couple of weeks. That's not possible. But how can we lift people's gaze upward and spark curiosity and imagination? Yeah, I love that.
Well, Jay, time for you to go and buy an e-bike and be flying through the streets of your neighborhood with your hair flying. Trust me, it's a great feeling. To all of our listeners, please check out our journals. Journal 1, Journal 2. These journals are available right now. Go to aspengroup.com/Making Space podcast. And thank you to all of our listeners, leaders, pastors. If you've been encouraged or learned something new today, we would love you to leave a rating or a review. Share this with a friend, and we'll catch you next time on the Making Space podcast.